humanists should humanists be anti-religion? So tonight, Stacey Shepherd and Don Cameron, two of our leading members of Bristol Humanists, will be explaining their slightly differing views on this complex question. I'm Chrissy Hackett, Chair of Bristol Humanists, and this evening I will be facilitating that conversation and asking for your views and trying to deepen our understanding of the issues involved. Could I ask you all, please, to make sure you're on mute? And also just to tell you that we are recording. So if you don't want to be recorded, you could switch off your video. We'll be recording the session and the Q&As and comments after the break, okay? And if you could not use the chat box during the first half, simply because it can be quite a distraction. So if you don't use the chat box during the first half, but after the break, just use it to pose your questions or your comments. Obviously relatively short comments, so that we can go through those and do them justice after the break, okay? So, as I say, I'm hopefully going to facilitate this conversation, and hopefully we'll all deepen our understanding of the issues involved during the course of this evening. So the question of atheist and humanist attitudes to religion has always been at the heart of what it means to be a humanist. In talking about and living our non-religious worldview, the question is, do we have to debunk religious beliefs? Why? To whose benefit? Does it work? How does that work when we work alongside religious people and organisations, as we do, in representing non-religious people in public life? I'm thinking of things like our work as non-religious pastoral support people in chaplaincies, our participation in public events such as Remembrance Sunday, or the opening of Nightingale hospitals or mortuaries, as we have done over the last nearly 2 years, and our work as humanist celebrants for weddings and funerals, and of course our role as school speakers. So we do engage with the religions and religious people in a number of ways that we live out our humanism, and all of us do anyway, just by our everyday interactions with people. So I think it's certainly an interesting conversation, whether we should be anti-religion or to what extent. So just to explain what we're going to do this evening, we're going to start our conversation by asking Don and Stacey to explain their positions, and then there'll be an opportunity for them to reflect back to each other what they've understood the other person saying, so that both people are sure that they've been understood by the other. And then there'll be an opportunity for them to ask each other questions. And then we'll take a 10-minute break in the middle of the evening. And then after that, using the chat box function, you hopefully will come back full of questions and ideas and things that you want to add to the conversation. And then I'll end up by asking Stacey and Don whether they've in fact changed or modified their position at all as the result of the evening's conversation. So let's get started. Don, can I ask you to tell us your basic position, please?
Okay. I would say that I believe that humanism has two basic strands. The one is that we adopt liberal and rational, I hope, values. And the other one is that we think that belief should be based on evidence, and we don't accept supernatural religion. Now, although I fully subscribe to the values, the ethical principles of humanism, that is not unique to us. In fact, we're very similar to many other people of different views. The thing that is unique to us is the fact that we are not religious, and the humanism has become the main representative body for those who don't believe in religion, and that is why I'm a member. But religion remains a serious problem. It's not only the Taliban, but in many parts of the world, there are evil things inspired by religion, which are commonplace. But less dramatically, but perhaps more importantly, churches wield enormous power. They have vast wealth, and they're exempted from tax. They have a grip on our school system, and they even have seats in the legislature. The only major countries in the world that do that, of course, are Iran and ourselves. Religiosity has been increasing in many parts of the world, such as the Islam majority countries and the ex-communist world. In the West, we have taken encouragement from surveys which show that a decline in religious identification has been happening. And in the UK, we now have more than 50% of people who describe themselves as having no religion. Even in the USA, which has long been much more religious than we are, a decline is showing some signs. But can we safely assume that the downward trend in religiosity will continue? Only a small proportion of the nuns, as they're called, are careful thinkers who have reviewed all the reasons and evidence for atheism. Many young people probably think that religion is simply not cool. Some people are disgusted by the sexual perversions of some priests, while others dislike religion's repression of their own sexual choices. Modern society has controlled many of the insecurities of life, which led some people to depend on religion, while others just prefer to go to the garden centre rather than church on a Sunday morning. And many of the people who tick the no religion box still harbour supernatural beliefs of one kind or another. With such an insecure basis of belief, a swing of fashion in the other direction is all too possible. I believe that it's vitally important for the good of our society, indeed ultimately for our safety, that we make an effort to encourage rational, evidence-based thinking. Against the enormous weight of propaganda promoting religion, we need to raise our small voice. Only a secure proportion of non-believers can ensure progress. The evidence in favor of atheism is massive. I won't go into it tonight, but religion is shown to be false by many of the sciences. Study of its history reveals how it came to exist. And its internal logic poses many problems. The problem of evil is almost enough in itself. There's a whole syllabus which confirms that religion is not true, and it's important that we get this information out to counter the barrage of the religious sales pitch, which surrounds us at a very high volume. So what should our policy be? If we avoid discussing our atheism, we will be more readily accepted in the many areas where we would like to participate. We will be considered harmless and by priests who have no reticence in pushing their message. But will we simply be surrendering the platform to them? In my view, we need a two-pronged approach. How we act depends on the circumstances. We should talk politely to priests and to those who are committed believers. It would be absurd to try to convert them. And we should aim to find areas of common purpose. But by doing so, we must ever so diplomatically remind them that we are here and that we deserve equally with them a place at the table. But to the nuns, to the young and to the uncommitted, we should be teaching the reasons and evidence. We should not pull our punches any more than the priests pull theirs. We should be making sure that an increasing number of people are educated in the overwhelming mass of evidence. Only that can make secular progress secure. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Don. As you will have realised, all of you listening, that whenever Don refers to nuns, he doesn't mean the wimple-wearing, rosary bead-carrying variety. He simply means those of nun, N-O-N-E, religion.
I think actually some of the Americans said become a nun, kick the habit.
Ah, marvellous. Okay, thank you very much, Don. Stacey, so although Don says that we should aim to find common purpose with committed believers and we should, you know, behave well around them and cooperatively and everything, we should educate people in the overwhelming mass of evidence against the truth of religion, and so forth. So is he right? And can you give us your take on the subject, please?
Sure, thanks, Chrissy. So I think when considering the question of whether humanists ought to be anti-religion, firstly, of course, it's important to establish what we mean by being anti-religion. If we simply mean a rejection of religious interpretation of the world, then I think this debate would be a very short one. By definition, anyone identifying as a humanist rejects a supernatural view of the world. If, however, we are talking about the proactive disparaging of religious ideas and religious people, then of course I think the conversation is much more complex and nuanced. So from what I understand of my fellow panelist, he advocates for what I perceive to be a rather evangelical promotion of atheism through logical reasoning and presentation of evidence. But not only am I unconvinced that this will be effective, I'm also not persuaded that the aim of conversion to atheism itself is actually compatible with humanist values. We could put our efforts into picking apart the logical flaws in the tenets of religious doctrines, but I think, firstly, you'll find that that's already been done and widely available. Many people who have left strict religious communities have spoken of coming across these sorts of arguments online, for example. But I think more importantly, it ignores the fact that people's beliefs are far more than just a set of ideas that can be easily squashed by facts and evidence. They are part of people's identities. They are stories that are told to them by the people that they trust the most. And to let go of them is to potentially rock the foundations of their very being. Next, we must consider what exactly is it that we are anti? Is it just religious doctrine? Is it the people that preach the doctrine? Or is it just the people that follow it? Is it just organized religion? Or is it the endless versions of people's personal belief systems? Are we saying that there is no value in any religious message, tradition, ceremony, or piece of art, for example? And I think that to say that humanists ought to be anti-religion is at the same time both too vague and too restrictive. So let's consider for a moment what humanism is for. Humanism advocates for the ethical treatment of others and for the pursuit of knowledge through the scientific method. It advocates for freedom of thought and of free thinking. It promotes tolerance of differences of view, but intolerance of dogmatic ideology. It is therefore, in my opinion, these principles that should act as the humanist compass for how to approach any idea, worldview, or person, be that religious or otherwise. And they do. So humanist groups, as we know, both nationally and globally, are already putting these principles into action via their campaigns and volunteer work. So rather than evangelize atheism, they teach critical thinking and campaign for children to be taught about all major worldviews alongside religion, so that the children themselves can come to their own conclusions, free thinking. They provide support to people who are leaving religious communities or fleeing persecution. They campaign for the protection of human rights when religious groups impose their beliefs on others to the detriment of their human rights. So, in summary, I would argue that it is far more meaningful to say that humanists should stand up for humanist principles than it is to say that they ought to be anti-religious.
Great, right. Thank you very much, Stacey. So, Don and Stacey, I'm going to ask you now to try to deepen your understanding of each other's position. First, by summarising what you each understand the other to be saying. So at this point, this isn't about questioning their view or making your own separate points, but simply mirroring back to them what your understanding of their position is in a very brief few sentences, really. So, Stacey, can you summarise Don's position for us?
Yes, so I think from what I understand is that Don, on a personal level, particularly values how humanists represent the non-religious in the community. I think that Don, rightly so, highlights the fact that we mustn't be complacent about the decline of religiosity, particularly in the West, because this ignores the significant amount of harm that clearly takes place in the name of religion or as a result of religious thinking globally. And I think that Don feels that the best way to address this is through proactive education, putting forward the case for atheism and the case against religion, as well as ensuring that humanists have a voice at the table alongside, religious representatives.
Yeah. Okay, that's a good summary. Thank you. So, Don, do you feel that what Stacey has said represents fairly accurately what your position is?
Yes, I think that's that's pretty fair.
Okay, good. So, Don, could you in turn summarise what you understand Stacey's position to be?
Well, I think what I understood from what she said is I think one of the big points that came out to me is that logic and reason and evidence isn't everything, that human beings are influenced by other things such as tradition and and what the religion means to them as people and families and so on. It's and I think the general feeling is that she's saying that we should represent positive views rather than negative refutation of other people's views.
Yes. Stacey, do you think that accurately represents what your position is?
Yeah, I think that's definitely fair. And I suppose I would just add that really it's about, where it's about putting humanism into action in a positive way.
Okay, so would you like to ask each other some questions, either directly about what you've each said, or it could be just, related to those views, some things that came up in your minds when you heard each other's points of view. So, Don, first, are there some questions you'd like to ask Stacey?
Well, I find myself that there isn't too much difference between Stacey and myself. I agree with most of the things she said, but there are one or two points which I would question. I think one thing you said was that the logical approach to religion and the evidence was something which had already been done. And that made me think that it's been done, but not everyone has picked it up. It's a little bit like mathematics has been done, but not everybody without education will become a mathematician. So I don't know if you got any reflections on that. The other thing, asking what we are anti, I need to clarify my own position there. I think we're certainly being anti-religious doctrine is not the same as being anti the people who either promote it or practice it. It's definitely an argument about ideas, not about people. And the thing about religious art, well, I would ask it, that should really mean that, because certainly some of the most wonderful art has been inspired by religion. And we wouldn't want to be like Islamic State, where they destroyed the temple of Athena in Palmyra and smashed all the ancient statues to bits. Bear in mind, of course, that they were the second group to do that to that temple. The first group were the Christians who did smash it, and it was the statue which had been painstakingly reassembled by archaeologists, which got smashed again. But no, religious art is something that should be preserved because it's wonderful for its own sake. So these are the little points that I would question.
Stacey, do you want to come back on those?
Yeah, I was struggling to remember what the first question was.
Okay.
The first one was the fact that the evidence had already been done. But
that's it. Yes.
Yeah. So that hasn't been spread well enough.
Yeah, so it's a fair point, and I agree that there's a difference between the evidence the information being available and the information being sort of transpired in a sort of in a proactive way. I suppose my point was, I know in talking with yourself before, Don, you've mentioned from your own experience that you would have felt that you would have benefited from having that sort of information available to you. And I would say that nowadays that sort of information is widely available, at least online. A quick Google and you'll find the sorts of arguments that I know that you've previously given as examples. So I suppose my point was more, that information is widely available. In terms of a sort of
when I was a teenager, Google certainly didn't exist.
No.
Yes.
I think there were only a few hundred computers in the world.
Yeah.
But in terms of a program of education, sort of, I suppose that's where, in my view, it starts to cross the line of evangelicism. Is that a word? And for me, I'd much rather teach the skill of critical thinking and ensure that a non-religious worldview is given a platform when children are learning about religious and ethics and religions and worldviews, and that they can apply that critical thinking to come to their own conclusions. Because for me, that is really the value of, part of the value of humanism is around, empowering people to think for themselves. And I wouldn't want to, for me, it would feel quite uncomfortable to essentially feel like we are preaching. And the second question was,
it was the fact that it's that it's the ideas that are a problem, not the people.
and the things around about art. Yeah, so I suppose my point here again was about, of course we don't just want to blanketly be anti anything which is religious, because I think we can all agree that there is some value that has come from the world of religion, be that through art has been inspired by religious ideas, or even some messages. Not all religious messages are terrible ones, and so for me, again, this is what my point about, okay, what humanists ought to stand for certain values, and then where those are, where the line is crossed, for example, where religious doctrine goes against those ideas, then we ensure that we have a platform to criticize those parts of that doctrine, or where we feel that people who represent religious organizations and infringe the human rights of others, we should be there to to ensure that those people have a voice. But there's such an endless myriad of versions of people's different personal belief systems that not everybody has a fundamentalist religious worldview, and therefore you might provide them with a list of evidence that these things aren't true, and they might turn around and say, well, of course those things aren't really true, but it's all just a bit metaphorical, isn't it? So it's just, I think that we must be clear in what it is exactly we are against and what we are for, rather than just this blanket we are anti-religious.
Yeah, and on the other question that Don said about art, and which you partially addressed, I mean, you're both really agreeing about that, aren't you?
Yeah, oh, absolutely.
Art and music and all the various things that have come to us, through a religious tradition, are absolutely there to be preserved. And yeah, okay. So going the other way round then, Stacey, do you want to ask Don some particular questions? Obviously you've covered some already in your response, I think.
Yeah, so I think I'm interested in understanding, I think Don probably has a more pessimistic view than I do about the direction of travel in terms of secularism and rational thinking. And I'm interested into understanding, whilst I agree we mustn't be complacent, I'm interested in understanding why Don doesn't, why it doesn't give Don confidence when he sees those trends in the reduction, the reduction of religiosity, particularly amongst young people, and that would suggest to me that generally young people carry those ideas with them through life. All right, they may alter to an extent, but I'm interested in understanding why that doesn't give Don such confidence.
Yes, I may be a little bit pessimistic, but certainly when I was a young person, which is a good while ago, as is obvious, I didn't have access to the various bits of evidence and reasoning. And when I first began to think that maybe the religion that I'd been taught in school was maybe not on such a solid basis as the maths and the chemistry, and I began to wonder about it, as I think you mentioned, I've said that I would have been grateful to have heard all this information. But as you say, it's now more readily available, but whether it's available enough, I don't know. I haven't done a survey of young non-religious people's views to really know what it's based on.
Yeah, that's one to come back. I've got a view on that myself, but I'm not allowed to put it in at this point, so I won't. Good. So are there other things you wanted to ask Stacey?
Oh, yeah, so I'm interested in So I think Don kind of picked up on this himself in terms of what he noticed from my argument, but I'd like to understand why Don thinks that his proposed approach would be effective in persuading people to adopt a humanist or atheist worldview in terms of this sort of very proactive sort of educational campaign putting the case forward for atheism. Particularly given the fact that we know that the complexity of humans and the nature of people's belief systems.
I think it's very important, and it is the policy of Humanists UK, that we respect everyone's right to hold their own religious beliefs, even if we don't agree with them, and that no one should be obstructed from their religious beliefs, provided they're not harming anyone else. But so certainly one would only be speaking of doing this kind of education with those who wish to subscribe to it. A little bit like the churches are doing with the Alpha course, where they invite people to join a course to learn a whole lot more about religion.
There is a humanist course that you can do online.
Yes.
Run by Humanists UK.
Well, that's a good thing.
And there is, of course, also the programme of school speakers going out there into schools and being increasingly, I mean, in terms of optimism, Don, I'd say the fact that we get invited by quite an increasing number of schools to go out there and do school speaking. And sometimes those are C of E schools who actually ask us in, because it's become part of the curriculum to at least, look at RE in terms of worldviews, not just the major religions, but also non-religious worldviews. So we have an opportunity in schools that we certainly didn't have a few years ago. So that would be another one.
I have served on the North Somerset Sacre for some years.
Yes.
And well, I've succeeded in getting a few footnotes added to the curriculum, but not a lot more than that.
But nonetheless, they are actually, schools are heads of religion and humanities, and heads of primary schools and so forth are inviting humanist speakers in. Yes. I mean, not in the numbers we'd like, I'm sure, but I don't know what the percentages are, but I think it's, it's very encouraging that we're being asked to do that. And certainly in terms of this discussion about how far can we be seen to be anti-religion, certainly if we're occupying a school platform, we never go in there to say your religious belief or your parents' religious belief is false. We only go in there to promote the positive values of humanism.
Yes, I agree. You have to be very careful in that sort of setting.
Sure.
Although we do notice on the Sacre we meet in various schools, and I've been to schools where the walls are covered with religious messages, and there's no humanist message there.
Yeah.
So there is an imbalance. Although progress, I agree with you, progress has been made in the last few years.
Yeah. So are there other questions you want to kick around with each other now? We've got a good bit more time before we need to take a break, but then again, we can take it early so that other people can come into this discussion sooner and give them more time. Stacey and Don, do you want to continue a little bit longer?
Well, I think what we're finding is that we agree on so many things.
Yeah.
It's not a lively enough debate, but we nevertheless do have some points to discuss.
Yeah.
I think it would be a good time possibly to take the break early and then bring potentially more differing views from the participants into it. And I'm going to take the opportunity to turn my light on because I'm starting to disappear into the darkness of my background as the sun is setting. Yeah, just the reflection in my glasses. Yeah, I'm getting a slightly demonic look, which isn't really fitting, is it?
Okay, so look, shall we do that? Where are you, Nick? Shall we take a break now so that people have got plenty of time to think of their questions and comments when we come back? And those questions and I'm not thinking of it as strictly a Q&A to Don and Stacey, although some of it can be. I'm also thinking of just people being able to put their own views and comments into the mix and perhaps having a more general conversation as far as we can within the limitations of a Zoom meeting. So
do you want to set a time limit on the break?
Well, I was thinking of 10 minutes. So what is it now? It's about 7 minutes past 8.
Correct.
Shall we say 20 past, or is that too long?
That leaves 40 minutes for questions. That feels about right.
Yeah. So we come back at 8:20.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, good. Well, I hope to see you all come back, because I think a really important part of this is the discussion we can all have together. Did Dr. Peter Brickley want to say something now?
Can I just ask, are we making comments on chat or straightforwardly here like this?
I think it would be helpful if you could do them on chat. Okay. I think we will be able to look at some hands raised, but because there's more than one screen's worth of us, it would be quite difficult to make sure we cover everybody. Okay. So if you can do it on chat, that will help us get questions better, I think. Right. Okay, thank you. Okay, so hopefully everybody's back. There's been some wonderful questions coming in. So if I could start just, what I'll do, I think, because there's quite a lot of questions, I'll read them out from the chat box. But if the people who asked the question want to come in, you can let me know, and you may indeed want to come in when Don or Stacey or myself, I guess, have talked about your question. So, okay. First of all, we have Mo, who says, "Hi Stacey, thanks for your wonderful ideas. I agree with you that the religious person logic might be prioritized in terms of navigating one's way in the world. Other factors, as you rightly mentioned, do..." Oh gosh, hang on. I've just accidentally clicked something silly. I'm just trying to get back. Sorry. Yeah, okay, I'm here. Other factors, as you rightly mentioned, do make it to the top of the list. However, I think you seem a little dismissive of interactive conversations as a way of enlightening religious people. She goes on to say, as an ex-Muslim who was born in the age of Google, I can tell you I never bothered to check arguments against Islam, and I was not alone in doing so. I'm thankful to a brave humanist friend who shifted my attention to the flaws in my own faith. I'd love to know what you think about that.
Yeah, thank you very much. And actually, if I came across as dismissive of that, then I didn't put myself across as I intended, because actually, I very much agree with you that sort of open dialogue and constructive conversation is a great way to promote or to present humanist ideas. And I think that it's important, you know, as you do with any human interaction, you know, you gauge with that individual what is appropriate and where, you know, you feel that it's right to go in that conversation. So I remember, you know, when I was at college, and that was sort of the time for me when I was starting to kind of really think about all of these things, and I was having a conversation with somebody who was religious, and we loved having this conversation and challenging each other and putting, you know, our case forward, and that was really enjoyable for both of us. But there would be other people where, you know, that they would really struggle with that. So I think I guess you have to get on those kind of individual conversation level, then I think, you know, depending if that person is open to having these conversations, then absolutely that's a great place to have them. And also I think, you know, as part of humanists ensuring that they, you know, that they have a voice at the table, you know, I was talking to Chrissy earlier about some of the kind of televised debates that you get around sort of ethics. So I think it's the big questions that they have on the BBC on a Sunday morning, and you quite frequently will have representatives from Humanists UK alongside you know, religious figures debating these sorts of topics and putting the humanist interpretation forward. So I think it's definitely important that we have those conversations. But to me, I suppose it's different from sort of I guess going around and sort of I guess campaigning a series of arguments against religion, if that makes sense. It kind of feels a bit different.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think that difference is partly about, you know, the respectful nature of the conversation, which, you know, between two friends, or as Mo says, a brave humanist who had that discussion with her, that will have been a respectful two-way conversation rather than us proselytizing and being evangelical about our own position, which seems a little bit of a misnomer, really, an evangelical humanist. Okay, so moving on, if that's all right, Mo, we'll move on. Stephen Mason, so you say, oh, sorry, Laurent was adding to that. So to add to Mo's comment, many ex-Muslims including from the UK, and he references the testimonies in UK's campaign Faith to Faithless. It was a support group more than a campaign. And many people have reported discovering very late on that other people had left the religion and they thought they were alone in the world since then. They hadn't even contemplated the possibility. So Laurent says, I think it's quite telling with regards to whether the information is sufficiently widespread or not. It's a similar point really, isn't it, about if we don't want to evangelize, but we want to make sure the information and support is out there for people who do want to question their religion they were perhaps born into. And whether Don or Stacey want to come back on that. Don, you're muted, by the way.
Yes, it's good to hear from Laurent. Is that the Laurent who used to be a member here in Bristol?
That's right, before he went to Mexico.
Yes, so it's very good to hear that he's keeping in touch from Mexico. Yes, it's always a difficult thing. As Stacey says, you have to judge who you're speaking with and what the right thing to say is. But if this kind of material is to be made available, it would be made available to people who had self-selected to hear it. So the risk of upset is minimized.
Okay. So moving on, unless you wanted to add anything to that, Stacey.
No, I was just really that you know, it's interesting actually to hear that perspective and you know, on reflection, you know, perhaps that information isn't as available as I initially thought, and actually, you know, there is a difference between, as Don says, you know, having something there that people can self-select to you know, to inform themselves on, rather than something which feels a bit more sort of being preached at, which is another thing.
Sure. Yeah. Okay, and Stephen Mason says, I think it's important to make a clear distinction between the spiritual content of religious thought and religious ideology. Ideology is political, and it is acceptable to oppose any political ideology that goes against one's own values. As Stacey has said, it is about values in the world, not about whatever spiritual ideas do or don't make sense to the individual. And he says it is quite possible to be firmly non-theistic, but still find value in ideas that are outside the provably scientific. And I think that's a very interesting one for us. I don't know what particular things you had in mind, Stephen, but the first thing that flew into my head was things like homeopathy, acupuncture, stuff like that. I don't know whether you meant that among many other things, no doubt. But people can find value in things that are not scientifically proven, and they can still be non-theistic and so forth. So I think it's a very interesting comment.
Do you want me? Can you hear me? And do you want me to come in on that?
Can you just clarify your question perhaps on those issues? Was that the sort of thing you were thinking about?
Yeah, I mean, well, in a way, there are 2 points that I made. One is that I think there is a clear distinction between the spiritual values people hold, which really should make no difference to me at all. If they want to believe this, that, or the other, that's different from what I believe, well, so be it. Where I think it makes a difference is if they then develop a political ideology from that, which they then try and impose on me or impose on other people. And if that goes against my personal values, then I feel that it's perfectly legitimate for me to oppose it as a political ideology. Yeah. The other point that I made was, yes, I think, I mean, from a personal point of view, I do not believe in any gods, but there are ideas and perspectives that come from the spiritual sides of religion that make sense to me without me actually having to believe them. If that makes sense to you. It's like, that's an interesting way of thinking of it, and I can use that without believing it literally.
Yeah.
So I'll hand that over to, I'll mute myself.
Okay, thank you, Stephen. Don or Stacey, do you want to come back on that?
Yeah, I mean, very much aligned with what Stephen's saying there, and I think it comes back to what I was saying around, there are things, I think we can all agree that there are things of value that anybody may be able to take from an idea that may have a religious origin without having to necessarily subscribe to, the entirety of a particular religious doctrine, or any kind of supernatural belief, or indeed enjoy the arts, again, as we said earlier, or even the rituals of things. So my partner is Hindu, and I'm often sort of participating in some of the sort of Hindu rituals, and that's quite enjoyable, but it doesn't mean I can detach from the religious interpretation of what's happening, and the sort of the sort of the sense of connection of what's with what's happening in terms of the ritual.
Sure. Yeah. And in fact, this whole thing also reminds me of a conversation that we've had with differing points of view, even within the Bristol Humanist Committee recently, which was on the subject of the soul. And that could be seen as rather, I think, related to what Stephen's saying, that we can have, some of us, I would, have a concept of kind of the soul, but it's more metaphorical than actual, but I still find it helpful. I find it helpful to think of a person's soul, but I absolutely don't mean that it's a part of them that's going to whiz off into eternity when they die, because I absolutely don't think that. But so yeah, there's that sort of metaphorical understanding of things, or things that make sense to us in the way like a poem might, but you don't have to absolutely believe every word that's literally there. So yeah, that's perhaps one way of looking at it. Shall we just, I know we've got a lot of questions, so I will move on if that's okay. So Andy says, I've heard many criticisms of atheism or humanism from religious speakers that we have been too dismissive of the value of religion and reduced it to a set of propositional beliefs. I agree, but also think these criticisms underestimate how many religious people themselves think in literal truth. Are we missing an opportunity to engage with more sophisticated thinkers if we are deemed anti-religious? I think you mean on false terms, do you? Yeah, which actually links to what we were just saying there, doesn't it? It's about how literal even religious thinkers are about the tenets of their religion. So do either of you want to?
Well, there is a great spectrum of different religious beliefs, even in people who are members of the same religion.
Yeah.
And well, that's to be expected. But certainly some people are fundamental literalists, and other people realize that that doesn't stand up to examination, and they take a modified view.
Yes. And I think that, there's an argument to be had, or a discussion to be had as well, about religious people who don't take the tenets of their faith absolutely literally. So in other words, the moderate religious. And I think Sam Harris famously said, didn't he, that he was addressing the problem of the moderates, because he felt that by being a little bit kind of less literal about their religion, it meant that the waters were muddied, that you couldn't say, yes, but you believe in the Trinity or the virgin birth or supernatural life hereafter or whatever. because, well, you probably could argue that one, but because there's a sense in which the moderate religious people will come back and say, yes, but that's just a metaphor. You don't have to believe that to be a Christian or a Muslim or a Hindu or whatever it is. And so there's that kind of, I think Andy's point is, do we throw too many people out of the discussion by assuming that they take it all literally? But then there's possibly another difficulty in conversing with people who are very moderate about it, and we don't really know what they stand for, and arguably some of them don't either. I don't know.
I can understand that point of view, but I find moderate people are easier to get along with than fundamentalists.
Oh, for sure, and I think they're better for the world as well. Yeah. Yeah. So Nick says, Nick Hooper, I get the impression that one of the dividing lines between Stacey and Don is their wish or willingness to engage with organized religion. In general terms, where would each of them say, no, this religion is too extreme for me to cooperate with?
I think the position is that one can cooperate with every religion unless it is actually practicing harm to other people. Apart from that, everyone should be quite free to practice what they wish.
I think it's a really difficult one, and I was reflecting on this earlier, and I can't say that it's something that I have that I've set my mind to yet, because you could argue that all organized religions are inflicting harm, because there are in many of their tenets or religious scripts, there are things which are clearly very harmful, or things things that they ask of their followers which are incredibly harmful. So it's a really difficult one, because I think we absolutely must share platforms, because that's about ensuring that the non-religious have a voice and that those ideas can be challenged. In terms of cooperation, I think that, or collaboration, I think that's where we have to be more careful, because of course, if you're doing things as joint projects, then in some sense you are endorsing to an extent, because there are some examples where it would be really obvious that you wouldn't collaborate, I don't know, Don mentioned the Taliban earlier. I can't imagine, humanists or a humanist group, collaborating with the Taliban. That just seems so obvious. So where then do you draw that line? And we do. So Humanists UK do collaborate with other, religious organisations. So one example is British Muslims for a Secular Society, and they collaborate on the shared ambition of a secular society. However, I'm sure there would be many things which, where there were conflicts. Well, of course, there will be conflicts between worldviews, but have that particular group in itself, done anything that's clearly harmful? Probably not. But then, representatives of the doctrines of certain faiths, by default, are preaching the tenets of their religion, texts of religion, which do promote harmful attitudes and behaviours. So I think it is a really delicate balance there.
And I suppose we could, you could say that even if you couldn't think of any particularly harmful things that some religions might be promoting, the fact that they're promoting the bringing up of their children within that, so before the children have got the ability to make any sense of things for themselves, one could say that that's kind of wrong.
Yeah, or just, there are clear parts of religious texts which are homophobic, misogynistic, you know, and that's not even really up for, that's not even, you know, that's they're very clear and very blatant. So and of course, you know, as we know, people take very different interpretation of those texts, but if you were, you know, if you were just to look at those texts, then you can't argue the fact that they you know, they clearly have passages which are, you know, incredibly harmful in their messages.
Yes, it's quite true that Deuteronomy is absolutely outrageous. But again, we need to be thankful for the moderates who don't take it literally.
Yeah. Okay, so here's another one from Chris. Much has been made of various ills from what is seen as religion, whatever that may be. Yes, many may have perished in so-called religious conflicts. However, in the interest of balance, I would observe that the ills and slaughter associated with atheism far outpace this. Look at Mao, Kim Jong-un, Stalin, Lenin, Hitler, etc., all vehemently anti-religious. Think about this. He goes on to say he holds a Christian position and see this as an expression of what has been referred to as humanism. Not quite sure I'm getting his drift there. And he goes on and makes some points about Christianity there. So possibly too long for us to go into, but he ends up saying, I routinely meet with Buddhists who are commonly defined as non-theistic. So what price supernaturalism here? It's the assumed definitions that need looking at.
Well, I think the story about Stalin and Hitler being non-religious, actually Hitler wasn't entirely non-religious, but the point is that there are bad people in every walk of life, and the only thing we can say is that Hitler wasn't doing what he was doing in the name of atheism; he was doing it in the name of other ideas.
Which goes back to Stephen's point about ideologies, I suppose, and making a distinction between the ideological aspect and the spiritual aspect of religions.
Although I don't think Hitler's ideology was driven by any religious view.
No. I'm just saying that an ideology in itself can be harmful and extreme and fundamentalist, whether it's religious or not.
Certainly so.
Okay, moving on. So Dr. Peter Brickley says, I'm wondering whether the evangelical approach goes beyond in the sense of clashes with the evidence-based principles of humanism. So we agree that humanists are evidence-based. This arguably likens them to scientists whose work rests on empiricism in the sense of the method of knowing the world via our senses and the sense we can make of them. My point is that empiricism is decidedly skeptical about the possibility of our achieving complete objective truth. Its origins in ancient Asia, arguably in the early teachings of Buddha. In so many ways, our modern world exists without the need for absolute truth. It is religion that is the exception. So would we not agree that part of the success of science in our modern world in the way it's existed separately from religion and in separate spheres? And does this therefore move us in the general direction of supporting Stacey's position? Though I agree there is not much between the two speakers. It's been a most interesting exchange of views.
We seem to be getting noises off here.
Yeah.
That's my dog. I'll mute myself for a moment.
I'm sorry, that was a bit wordy. I had difficulty really getting it down in 10 minutes.
Oh, sorry, yes. Do you want to clarify your question so that they can address it in, not too great a length, because we've got some more to go through.
I mean, if Buddhism is evidence-based, evidence does not get us to truth. Therefore, we really don't have a complete purchase on the issues of spirituality. They're separate from issues of evidence-based and our empirical realities. Therefore, all we can do really is just point out what we think is the right way to live and what we think is true and what seems to us is reasonable. and just hope that we're going to pull over people like that. This is basically Stacey's position, as I understand it, and indeed, we all seem to be saying nearly the same thing. And certainly, I can't see any way that we can sort of say that that religion is completely wrong. I mean, lots of bits of it, of course, are wrong, but the fundamental idea that, you know, of spirituality is not something that we can really affect, I think. Therefore, we shouldn't try. We should remain on good terms and put our case and hope that it is seen as better. Sorry, that's it.
Okay.
I think that we need to think clearly here. Science says nothing about values. Science is a procedure of finding out fact, and it of course can say something about values when it's studying the origin and the nature of human values, but that's studying values. That's not saying what they should be.
Well, that's the point.
It's rather a complex consideration here, but Stephen Jay Gould, the biologist, he sort of tried at one point to say that science and religion were two non-overlapping magisteria, and that idea has been generally decried because, in fact, science and religion are in conflict in a great many areas. But the relationship of science and values is a complex one.
Of course, it's a complex one, and of course, science gets us to facts, but facts are just that, factors. Facts don't tell us about values. Facts will never tell us how to live our lives.
Humanist values essentially come from the fact that if we adopt them, we will all be better off. And it's to our advantage to have an empathetic attitude to other people, and in other words, to get along.
And you can't prove that. That's the point. You can't be evidence-based and prove that.
You can't prove that we should do it, but you can prove that it's in our interest to do it. You can't prove, of course, what our interest should be, but we've all got an instinctive feeling for that.
Okay, I'll move it along now, but thank you very much for clarifying that and for answering, Don. I'm trying to go to somebody who hasn't already asked a question, so I'm skipping one or two. Sorry. So Mike Flood, how should we humanists show our intolerance of intolerance? I'm thinking of the latest Texas law on abortion, the Taliban and the Taliban's use of suicide bombers, assassination of a well-known folk singer, and last week's report on religions covering up sexual abuse of minors. This is pure evil. So how should we humanists show our intolerance of intolerance?
Well, we can only speak against these things. There's no more that we can do. And hopefully, if not convince the intolerant, at least convince those who are taking a neutral view.
Yeah, I think as well as using our voice, I think that, you know, we can try to, I think we have to try to understand people, you know, why do people do these things? And I suppose, you know, look at sort of evidence as to the best way to prevent such things happening. You know, how can we prevent people from becoming radicalized in a way that they, you know, commit such atrocities, or, you know, how can we prevent people from having such extreme views around women's reproductive rights, for example. I think that, you know, understanding the complexity of people and why these things happen, and therefore what we can do as a society to prevent that, is another thing.
Yeah.
Chrissy, I think Mike Flood wants to add something.
Mike, yes, hello.
Thank you, and it's very nice to be with you from Milton Keynes.
Ah, welcome.
When we set up in 2007, there was a lot of discussion in some of our meetings about, you know, people enjoyed taking on religious people, particularly on the internet. And I was very keen to discourage that because I didn't think it went anywhere. And we haven't really discussed religion in our group since then, not in any great detail. But we had a Muslim, an octogenarian Muslim, very brave man, came to one of our meetings, and a couple of us subsequently went along to a local mosque, and we met with a young imam who came down from Birmingham. And we were very impressed with this guy, and I relayed this message back to the Muslim. Afterwards, I said how impressive this guy was, and he said, "Oh, he speaks with a forked tongue. That's not what he says on a Friday." Now, I'm just becoming, particularly with this latest legislation in Texas, which is just so appalling, that people can rat on anybody who's involved with it. I just find the whole thing is just pure evil. And I'm beginning to question whether my own position of not discussing this, I don't really see a lot of point in talking to religious people, because I don't know what we're trying to say to them. So kind of kept away from that. But I'm beginning to think that maybe this is a rather pathetic way, and that we should be speaking out against, the Taliban executing a folk singer just for nothing, or a police officer. It is just pure evil, or sending suicide bombers in to kill lots of people. I don't know whether we've got anything to talk with these people about.
I think that relates as well to the point about this, political ideologies rather than individual people's beliefs, doesn't it? And therefore it brings us back to the whole secular question, that if as humanists we don't see very much value in proselytizing humanism or adamantly arguing against anybody else's religious belief, that's one thing. We may decide that's just either not what we should be doing or not tactically useful or something. But in terms of, we're also secularists, aren't we? We all humanists think that church and state, or religion and state, should be completely separate. And if we, certainly as one of the things we do, if we focus on that and put our efforts into making our world and other countries that we can affect at all into more secular societies, then at least those evils perhaps wouldn't be multiplied and visited upon such numbers of people. I don't know. That's
enough.
Can I just say that I think not only humanists, but practically everybody is appalled by these terrible acts.
Yeah.
But the question of sparring with religious people, while some may find it fun, I agree with you that it goes nowhere and makes no sense. And I haven't been advocating that, but I'm advocating presenting our case to the young and to the uncommitted.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you.
Sorry, I'm moving swiftly down through to find people whose questions I haven't done yet. I'm sure there are some more here. I've got Stephen again and Andy again, but I'm not at the moment seeing. Maybe that was it. I tell you what, you are allowed to wave your hands in the air if you're on video. If there's anybody who has posed a question or desperately wants to, and they're not getting through to me, can you, wave at me? Related to the evil question just now, we have got one from Kevin Lawrence. It seems to me that you are both converging on a line that defines what is acceptable in our advocacy of humanism. So he wants to know what is an example of something that crosses the line. So you're converging on a line that defines what's acceptable in advocating humanism. What would be something that crosses the line?
Well, I think it would certainly cross the line when we're insulting or abusive about religion, but that's an entirely different thing from saying that we do not agree with it because of this piece of evidence and this reasoning.
Yeah.
I think for me, as I probably made clear, anything which feels like preaching, because for me, that's what religions do, right? They preach. So why would we want to preach at people? And Yeah, and I suppose it's again a respect thing, and I think we've touched this a few times. You know, we can be respectful of people without respecting their ideas, and I think it's. I mean, I suppose that kind of goes without saying, really, that's something that we should always be mindful of.
But I think one person will describe something as preaching, while another person could describe it as a reasonable statement of views. It depends where you come from.
And I think.
Sorry, carry on.
No, I was just going to say, I know that Chris, you used the word context earlier, or somebody used the word context, and I think that's really important, isn't it? Because I think, you know, if we're in a setting where clearly, you know, that kind of debate is welcome and appropriate, and it's another thing to kind of, you know, try to impose our views on other people. But that, of course, doesn't mean that we shouldn't feel free to express our views or to politely criticise the views of others.
Yes, I agree with that totally, and I think it has to be said that many religious people adhere to that principle as well. They tend to people nowadays, more than in former times, people will avoid letting a very religious view forward, and they tend to do it in a situation where people are expecting to receive it.
Yeah. And I think part of that is respect, you know, on both sides, respect for other people's point of view, or their right to have that point of view. And also because, like us, religious people some of them have come to the conclusion that it doesn't actually work to lecture uninvited, because, you know, and it goes back to one of the points Stacey made at the beginning, I think, that most people's religions are not necessarily based on reason in the first place. They're based on, or they're very much contained within their emotional sense and sense of themselves and their family and their life that's meaningful for them. So arguing on a logical level against that is like, you know, dealing with two different categories and not realizing that they don't actually overlap half the time. Anyway, look, it's a few minutes to 9, and so what I wanted to do before we close is to just go back to Stacey and Don and ask you in a sentence, really, just whether you have changed your position, not that they were diametrically opposed by any means, but whether you've changed or modified your position as a result of either what each other has said and what you've heard from the people who are with us this evening. Stacey, can I ask you first?
Yes, I think the main thing for me, and I mentioned this earlier, is that it's made me think about whether or not there is sort of sufficiently available information out there for people who might be interested in or who are, you know, exploring these questions, and is there anything that we could do as humanists to support them in that exploration? So I think that is actually a really interesting question and something that we could certainly take away from this debate.
Yes, and we could even take it straight into our Bristol Humanist Committee meeting the next time we meet, because I'm sure there's more we could be doing out there. John?
Well, yes, I think one thing I've taken from it is that we must think carefully about context, that what we say depends on who we're speaking to. And we must bear in mind that there's an emotional and a traditional element to religion besides the actual matter of its literal truth.
Yeah. Okay, well, look, that sounds like a good place to end. Thank you all so much for coming. Follow us on our Bristol Humanist Meetup page and our Facebook